And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome to the Teach Thought Podcast. Terry, introduce yourself.
My name is Terry Ike. I'm a former classroom teacher and now director at Teach Thought, which means I do a lot of different things very badly.
And I'm Drew Perkins. I'm the Director of Professional Development here at Teach Thought, and hopefully that means I do a lot of different things really well.
And together we're hosting a podcast, which hopefully makes Teach Thought more accessible to you in more places, right, Drew?
Well, hopefully, yeah, but mostly it's just me hosting it because you just add episodes every so often, right?
Well, I've got things to do. Remember, I'm director.
That's true. Hello again, this is Drew Perkins. Thanks for tuning in, as always, to the Teach Thought Podcast. And in today's podcast, I had the pleasure of speaking sort of a part two with JuanCarlos Arauz about our equity and how that looks in our schools actually doing equity, not just talking about it. We tried to get to that in the first part, but kind of kept at a 30,000 foot view. So in this episode, we got into the pieces, especially around assessment and differentiation and content and process and product and learner interest and preferences and things like that. So we did finally get into a bit more weeds. We didn't quite get to depth around data analysis and lesson planning like we had hoped, but perhaps for a future podcast. As always, we would appreciate any sort of reviews and reshares and all of those things because it does help. So if you are an iTunes listener, please jump on over to iTunes and give us a rating and review. It helps us not only revise and think differently about our work, but it helps it to become more widespread. And that is our goal with this podcast, is to reach more listeners and to help sort of move that ball forward in education, move that rock forward. So without any further ado, I bring you JuanCarlos Arauz. Welcome. I am here again with JuanCarlos Arauz, and this is our second of two-part, at least at this point, two-part podcast and discussing equity and kind of getting a little bit more into the details this time. If you had listened to the previous podcast, we attempted, I think, and hoped to get down into some of these details, but we got, I guess, maybe waylaid in the 20,000 feet, really kind of taking a look at the big picture. So today we're going to try to get down into some of the pieces of equity and what it really looks like when equity is in action and what that work looks like, as well as hopefully some intersections with project-based learning. So welcome, JuanCarlos, and you want to say hi to the folks?
Yeah, thank you very much. Hello, good morning, at least for where I am, and excited to hear you, Drew, and working with you again here for our second piece.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and dive into it. And again, really thinking about not what it looks like or sounds like to talk about doing equity work, because as we mentioned in the last podcast, there's lots of folks who will say they want to do equity work, they want to check off the box and have a workshop or a day or whatever the case may be to say, see, we've done it, but now what does it actually look like? And I want to start us by thinking about it in the context of project-based learning and how those intersections are, and maybe some of the pieces of our project-based learning model. And one of those is meaningful assessment. So when we think about project-based learning and meaningful assessment, what we want to think about is how do we use assessment in a way, how do we have that be a part of projects and the teaching and learning in ways that's not punitive, that is a sort of, I joke sometimes in when we do workshops, it's like we want students to come in and not have like, okay, today is assessment day, or sort of pop quiz day, if you will. And of course, the groans that go around the room, or that sort of negative feeling, but sort of like, yay, it's assessment day. And while I sort of joke about it. It's like it's probably not going to be like first graders at a birthday party. We do want them to be able to think about and have the sense or the feeling that assessment is helpful, it's meaningful, and it's for a purpose. It's going to help us get better. So as you think about assessment from an equity standpoint, what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're really asking the right questions when we think about assessments, and the concept of assessments is really for helping the educator to know what is missing as opposed to what's wrong. And oftentimes what's missing is more about the teacher practice than it is about what the student knows. And so I think thinking about assessment from that vantage point is important. And so I think to illustrate that, I always, want to reference this, in what it's grounded on. But I remember the quote, and you've heard of the quote as well, of Albert Einstein, that people reference to Albert Einstein. I don't know if it was him or not, but it goes with, everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, its whole life it'll be believing that it's stupid.
All right.
So something of that, just to start off with, is when I think about assessments is, the attitude of our educators in our system to think, look, there's brilliance in the minds of our students. We just got to figure out what kind of brilliance they have and how do we bring it out, is really key. And then thinking about assessments during the course of a year that are helping inform teacher practice as opposed to solely measuring student knowledge.
Yeah, we did a podcast. I did a podcast, and I actually we just tweeted it out with John Merrow, who was a journalist with public television. And one of the quotes that he said, and I don't know that he would attribute or take credit for this, but it was something like, what our schools should be asking about students is how are you smart, not how smart are you?
Yes.
So recognizing those differences, and that's a sort of a semantic shift, but it really is about that, right? I mean,
yes.
And I think about it in many ways, like about the curriculum that is being, I guess, in many ways, like teachers feel such a responsibility to be teaching these things because that's what they've been told to teach. But are those really the things that students need to learn to go forward? And if it isn't, I mean, if it's wider than that, and I think most teachers in almost every class would say it is wider than that. I mean, when we talk about ideal graduates, it's certainly not content driven, it's skills driven. So what is it, does that open us up to things like how are you smart, not how smart are you? What do you know, but what are you able to do kinds of things?
Well, that's perfectly well stated, because it reminds me of this concept of, it's not an either or conversation, it's a both and conversation. So I'm a strong believer that we want to make sure we have a baseline for students that when they graduate, they know how to read and write. They know how to solve complex mathematical problems. I want to make sure that there's some baselines that do exist. But I always go back to, as a teacher, that if a student wasn't achieving whatever the benchmark was for that year, that was more on me than more on the student. That was more on me understanding the concept of differentiation. And so the reason that we have, or one of the reasons we have such a challenge today with students struggling, not just in school, but out of school, as you and I know, and why you have the ideal graduate, is even when you leave school, formal schooling, companies, organizations are saying that this is not, good enough. And it's because we've used the concept of assessment as such a narrow defining process, and not doing the both and conversation, just using the exam as the only concept for selecting students, as you know.
Are there specific pieces as you work with schools that are assessment pieces that you suggest in order to really get at equitable practice? Are there things that are specifically non-equitable that you see in schools and teachers and schools engaging in?
Absolutely. When we think of this as equity, we think of it in two forms. For me right now is in the relation as it relates to assessment. So one specific thing is assessments just being culturally incompetent. And so what I mean by that is if we continue to have assessments measuring your level of success based on how well you do on an exam, but those exams are culturally incompetent, meaning they are out of context for students who are unfamiliar with the context that they're in, then you're measuring not just specifically, the content, can they solve a math problem, but then you're asking them to understand basically the context. I give two examples. One concrete example, and then I'd like to think that they're no longer in use, but who knows, is that oftentimes, in elementary schools, which is where the beginning of the track system,
Right.
for students begins, is that you'll find in elementary school sometimes they'll give mathematical word problems, nothing wrong with that, but then they'll start putting content vocabulary in there that, quite frankly, it's not about the vocabulary level, it's the context. So if students grow up in a low socioeconomic background and you start using paragraphs where they're talking about, cutlery or saucers or, cupboards, where maybe that's something that is foreign to the student, then they can get lost in the word problem and never get to the actual problem to solve. The other example is in English, that we're trying to measure reading levels, but too often what we're measuring is reading in English, not reading levels. And then we often have second language students struggling in schools and teachers misdiagnosing that the student cannot read when really it's that the student doesn't know English. And so just the concept of are we measuring how a student can read by third grade, or are we measuring how a student, can read English? I think both are important, but I also think to transcend this is that maybe learning how to read in more than one language would actually help all students, not just those who don't know English coming in. And so what we like to say is one form of equity is how do we give everyone what they need in order to help them succeed in the current system?
It's the pieces around context and language I think are important, and I'm there's some research out there. I have listened to some folks talk about the whether tests are culturally biased, and there's some research to say that some of the big ones like SAT and ACT are not necessarily, but I do still think even if you would agree with that, there's still language that at times might trip anybody up depending upon context. And the example, when I was teaching psychology, I would talk about testing and IQ tests, especially as we were talking about IQ tests. And the example that I would give, and it almost every time played out in my classroom, where I would have at least one or two kids who at the high school level were minorities, and I would throw this question out there and say, hey, will you turn the Def Leppard down? And of course, lots of the kids would say, I don't know, or they would say, oh yeah, I'll go turn down the radio, because Def Leppard, of course, is like an 80s, 70s, 80s, 80s into 90s rock band. And the minority kids would struggle they would not have any idea what that meant, because they weren't familiar with, just culturally, the idea, like they didn't know what Def Leppard was. They didn't know it was a band. But to that point also, some of the kids didn't get it because it was too dated. They were living they grew up in a time when Def Leppard wasn't anywhere on their radar, so they would not know what that meant regardless of their culture. It was more age. So, those things certainly do pop up in our reality to the extent that which that's sort of culturally biased, if you will. I think I know there's certainly some debate there. But yeah, when we think about assessment, we try to make this point in our workshops and when we work with teachers is that you should be really purposeful about what you're trying to gather information on. Like, what are you really assessing? And if you're assessing their reading level or are you assessing their English ability, that those are, like you said, two different things, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the, not that already teachers have more than enough to do, but I think, for educators with the commitment in the classroom to really, demonstrate how each student shines, that's a very daunting task. And I think just as you're saying, step one is just critically asking the questions as to what is this test really measuring? And the better I, as a teacher, know what this test is really measuring, then I, as a teacher, can help create lessons that are going to help achieve student success academically as it relates to the test.
Yeah, and it's so easy. It really is easy, I think, for teachers to fall into the trap. And I know this because as a teacher for 15 years, I experienced this and to the extent, I'm not sure how much of a reality or how it's changed, but, textbook companies would, you'd buy these textbooks and there were CDs or DVDs or whatever that you would load tests up on your computer and those were easy to print out. So just in the sense of time management, it's so much easier to be able to just print those things out. But I think thinking differently about assessment so that it's not, this 50 questions, but it's more authentic and there are pieces of formative assessment along the way, especially not just these sort of bigger summative assessments. That's good teaching practice, but also I think allows maybe for more depth or I guess looking at your assessment practices through lenses like equity.
Yes. And I think that's, it goes back to the space where, it's really clear that it is challenging as a teacher with so many responsibilities that they have that it's often overlooked. But that overlooking is what helps reinforce the stereotypes. It helps create the achievement gap. It helps create the gap of opportunities. And so this is where I always, go back and you offer the challenge to educators, how serious are you about, really believing that all students are brilliant? We just got to figure out how to differentiate our instructions.
So the pieces of differentiation, we talk about 6 elements of differentiation and differentiated instruction being content, process, and product, and then readiness, interests, and learning preferences. And we've talked a little bit about content, but what about process and product? Those are big pieces, I think, in our project-based learning work that we really, that we really try to emphasize a real strong balance, not just on the product, but a balance of process and product, but there obviously should be related. Are there specific things with regards to process and product that we need to be aware of with equity practices?
Yeah. Well, when we think about, again, equity, understanding what we were sharing in part one of our talk here is that, equity is really understanding that it is that concept of differentiation, that brilliance looks different in different ways, and then students achieving looks different in different ways. And so, equity, we can always think of this in terms of just, if there's a project that educator's trying to go and complete, realizing that something as simple as the process, we all know that there are students who are better performing tasks if the process is where they are left alone in silence or with headphones on. They just work better that way. Now, the process is that students work better if they're actually in a group and they're actually working. So no one's going to disagree, I think, with that concept. Where it gets when we talk about equity is that oftentimes, again, where the issues of race, class, gender, et cetera, come into play, is that what is viewed as a group of students of color actively working on a project together, laughing out loud, can be viewed as disrupting the rest of the class, can be viewed as a discipline issue, can be viewed as not classroom engaged. Because for the teacher, maybe it's easier for them to manage a classroom where everyone is silently working on their project. So just as that process, as an example, we've seen too many times where, again, students are disciplined because as the teacher is perceiving this as, well, the student's not on task. That may be the case. That may also be not the case in the sense of where we like to say is, what if students actually just perform better collaboratively? And as a result, we need to create a structure where the process allows students to collaborate. And as you and I know, as human beings, when we collaborate, we might need to get a project done in say 30 minutes, but during that process, we may be intently focused on the process, or we may actually, talk something, random about what happened last night. And then we, through that, we're actually doing the process at the same time. But that requires, again, a level of advanced understanding and awareness of your own biases at the same time.
I just had a conversation just before we connected to record this with a woman in New York City, Irina Nayfield, and she'd contacted us about her inquiry work, and she's done lots of work around inquiry at PhD level dissertations. And one of the things that we were discussing in our call was that very sort of cultural difference, and I was wondering aloud to her, because in her research, and I haven't had a chance to take a look at it yet, she's going to send it to me, but we had a really interesting conversation. And in her research, one of the things she was focusing on was that lots of kids, there's an assumption, and I think it's very true, that kids are great askers of questions. They ask lots of questions. However, what she found in her research, and again, I haven't had a chance to take a look at it, the specifics, but she said that in low SES, socioeconomic status, Head Start kinds of programs, that you don't see as many questions in these early elementary, pre-elementary kids as you might see in, middle class America, non-minority classrooms. And what I wondered aloud, and I had sort of pulled this from the work of the Right Question Institute, their book, Make Just One Change, but that culturally there are students, I think, that come from families who either explicitly or implicitly try to, they know that those students asking questions in classrooms may indeed be seen as a challenge to authority, defiance, and therefore they sort of make the sort of blanket statement of, sort of keep your head down and keep your mouth shut and don't ask lots of questions, which of course is tremendously detrimental to the educational process, because as our rich inquiry for project-based learning being one of those levers, you don't obviously have rich inquiry without students asking lots of great questions.
Yeah. I would respond with, I agree, and I want to offer some practical pieces, I think, that for me illustrate the need for educators to identify this. We'll take, for example, as you know, Drew, we've been working on a diagnostic tool that measures innovation, adaptability, critical analysis, communication, and teamwork. What we have found is that we could help educators become more culturally competent, try to become more culturally relevant but that really requires a level of mastery of multiple years of learning in order to achieve that. What we have found to be, I would say, maybe as a intermediary step towards achieving that, is that what if we were to help educators see how collaborative students are and how innovative they are? Because as you were just stating, they may not see it on first glance because of their context that they're coming from. So I always use the example of most educators have a college degree. Well, all educators have a college degree. Many, if not most, depending on the school systems there, have an advanced degree. And so when you think about what it has taken these adults to achieve that, a lot of it has been through traditional education, which is on your own with in a library, studying away and writing a lot of papers. So if you can think of 20 plus years of doing that, there's a way now that has been ingrained into the educator of what actual learning looks like. Even if they don't believe it, their habits have been created that way.
Right.
So I share then this diagnostic tool with those same educators who have been trained this way and formed this habit, where they gave this type of diagnostic tool to their students, the students that you were just talking about, for example, and found that their scores around innovation and collaboration were really high. Well, that shifted the perception for the educator of saying, wow, these students are pretty smart. I want to make sure I give them room to be able to innovate and give them room into collaborating. And with some of those teachers that we were able to work with during the year, many of them would come back and say, well, I didn't understand how the student is innovative because the student continues to do this and that. And then, or I don't know how they're collaborating because they continue to do this and that. And I asked, well, what's the this and that? And they said, well, they keep talking to their friends all the time. Every time we're doing, work, or, they're doing multiple things on their handouts instead of just doing the ones that I'm asking them to do. And I was like, well, I guess that sounds a little bit innovative and a little bit collaborative. Just the structure of that you've created doesn't allow for that. That started to shift how they saw innovation, how they saw collaboration. And then it opened up into, how do I change my classroom so that I can create those spaces? Not every time, but definitely to help create the process so that we can have that great end product.
Yeah, it often strikes me in professional development settings when teachers express that sort of frustration around kids being off task. And to be clear, that is a reality, and I don't want to give the illusion that I'm expressing that we should allow kids to be off task at all times. But the very behaviors that adults will engage in professional development settings, which is being off task, quote unquote, looking at Facebook on their phones or texting with, family or lots of different things, needing to take a phone call, the parallels to what they see with students and they complain about with students is often, it's sort of comical in some ways. And as a teacher, I often, I would put, I was not a big sort of bulletin board guy like you see these sort of fancy teacher bulletin boards. I lined my classroom with all these different posters and things, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily the best way to go about it, but I had the 10 Commandments from Native Americans. I had, just all kind of different visuals, things that were not in any way, shape, or form educational or necessarily inspirational. But I think you have to recognize that students, just like adults, are not going to want to stand or sit and stare at you for 50 minutes or however long your class is, and that even if they're in collaborative groups, that they are likely to organically talk about things that are not necessarily exactly on task at times. And so, I recognize, look at these posters and get your brain to think about different things. And like in our Grow 17 event, which we held last week in Louisville, our first keynote speaker was a magician, an illusionist that had nothing in particular to do with education, but those things are different. Like it just really, we want that sort of cross-pollination. It is important to then focus it and use that thinking in a way that's useful. But, people, just like anybody, they need brain breaks, and sometimes they do need to have conversation around other things and learning how to manage that process.
I think you ended with the right point of how to manage that. And that's what challenges, I think, all educators in the classroom. I applaud all educators who are still in the classroom. And as you and I know, I think it's over 70% of educators who leave the classroom do so within their first 3 or 5 years. So anyone who's still teaching after 3 to 5 years, I commend them, because really they're the resilient ones. And how do we really support these educators to become master educators? As you and I know, I think it was in my 3rd year that I finally got the system of teaching, of being able to have what I call the endurance of teaching nearly 150 students at 50 minutes, periods, 6 to 7 periods a day. And get into the swing of things of that. So I want to commend the educators who are doing this, and how to manage that mix is what is often challenging. And right now the challenge often is how do we ensure that we create enough structure in those 50 minutes, if we still have those 50 minutes. But even if you have block scheduling, that's a lot of content, and that's a lot of planning that requires. And we know that as educators, we don't have a lot of time. We have the teacher burnout that's very real. One teacher who's exceptional that I'm thinking of right now, who taught at a public high school, then left and taught in adult community school. Just quite frankly said, I'm just tired. And she's after her 6th year and says, I just need to take a break because this is so intense. How do we help educators manage that? And that's why I think, like your conference or some of our tools, what we're trying to do is, it really is not a bad idea to learn a few magic tricks. No joke, intended. Because, that wouldn't hurt to make sure somewhere in the middle that you do that, a magic trick just to capture their attention, change gears for a second, and then go back into the content. Or on our end, utilize the diagnostic tool to really help you see how students really are brilliant around these skills that they've gained. How do we tap into that for them to be successful in the classroom?
Yeah, and there are lots of skills that one of my favorite things to do with teachers, and I used to do this with students, is a thing called the scissors game, and I won't go into the details of it, but essentially one of the big takeaways is, and I think teachers are smart to think about this kind of thing of, if you want to teach skills like collaboration and communication and be able to assess them and those things, sometimes it can be, sort of to your point, really important and helpful to be able to sort of get students to engage in those kinds of practices outside of the content, and because the complexity of content learning sometimes can be overwhelming, tiresome, exhausting, and hard. So that makes it hard for students to engage in high-level collaboration because their brains are sort of really overloaded, if you will, with the content. So step away from that content for something that gives them an opportunity to practice collaboration and gives you an opportunity to teach and assess it perhaps, and then you can get back into the content, and hopefully those, you want those skills to be able to be transferable. So, but it can be, really a nice brain break, right?
Yeah.
And our magician that opened up Grow 17, the theme was making the impossible possible, which of course is what magicians make it feel like it's happening. But that's sort of the art of teaching, is it feels somewhat impossible for some students. How do you give them the opportunities to struggle, but struggle productively, where they're not shutting down, but they're pushing forward. And so that kind of brings me to, as we think about differentiated instruction, the sort of the next three pieces. We talked about content, process, and product, but readiness, interests, and learning preferences. And I think especially interests and learning preferences, the entry points, if you will, for students into learning. If you're fighting a battle of compliance, and I think that is one of the dynamics that is absolutely most destructive in our schools, is that teachers are constantly fighting this battle of compliance. Like, I'm going to give you some work and ask you to do this, and boy, I sure hope you do it, because if not, then we're in a fight. We're sort of a figurative fist fight. And when I've taken educators to project-based learning schools where they're doing it really well, they oftentimes, especially administrators, will note there's this lack of tension between the adults and the students, because there's not that dynamic of, boy, I sure hope they do what I'm asking them to do, because if not, then I've got to either do some magic trick to get them to do it, or I've got to say, here's what's going to happen if you don't. And some students will do it because they don't want to have that punishment. Others will say, well, F you, because I don't care. So pardon my French there, but how do we, I guess my question is, as you think about student interest and learning preferences in the context of equity, what does that conversation look like?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and this is where, for some listeners, this may be, a little challenging to hear, but I'll preface it with some science, which is what I try to do when we have to talk about these hard topics. So one of the most inequitable things is the way absolutely we do our classroom management systems and our school, policies around discipline. And it is in such a deficit mindset that it's no surprise that, quite frankly, we get the results that we do get. And what I mean by that is, we know that in training, for any kind of training, whether it's training animals, whether it's training adults, we know that positive reinforcement is more successful long-term than negative reinforcement. Mm-hmm. So that's just science talking. That's not you and I talking. And so if we know that, it's not that negative reinforcement doesn't work. I'm talking about long-term though. And so what we always like to say from our end as equity-minded folks is that this is what the education school to prison pipeline looks like. This is one component of creating this discipline of negative reinforcement that if you are not compliant with me, you will now get a demerit of some sort, and we will create that as a repetitive pattern of behavior for you that follows exactly what the prison system is like, what specifically society is like. And as a result, what you get are a lot of students who become what I would say even defiant. And a lot of it is because it's intuitive for students who are, quite frankly, really clear that, this system is not designed for them because they're pushing them out in one way or another. So we, from our end, think of this, of how do we get, moving out of that is asking educators to consider, well, what if the content was relevant to the student? And if you did that, then students would be engaged such that they would want to continue that process.
Right.
There isn't a kindergarten program, a preschool elementary program, that when you put students engaged in what they want to play with, in fact, what you end up getting, and you remember this as a parent as I do, we had to deal with in preschool and elementary with children being so engaged that they believed everything was theirs. No, that's my toy. No, that's mine, right. mine. That's how engaged they were. Those were the issues that we were dealing with. And so I think that's the thing to consider, is that learning preference actually is equitable when we focus on the content and context that's really relevant to the students. Students will rise to that occasion because that's the positive reinforcement that they're looking for, and as a result, want to engage in achieving the learning that you want them to achieve.
Well, it seems, one of the things that teachers will say sometimes, and I don't hear this a lot anymore. Maybe it's because the folks who are in our workshops are maybe a bit more forward thinking, but the idea that kids don't have that kids have such a short attention span, it's so hard to teach them, and I can tell you that that's certainly not the case. They do have a short attention span with things that are not interesting to them, and that of course is true, right? Yeah. I tell the story. I was in Knoxville, Tennessee a couple years ago, and I was working with schools in Knoxville, public schools, but I was at, if you've ever been in Knoxville, there's, I think it's called Market Square. There's lots of restaurants, and there's a main area where people can walk, and there's a stage there at one end where they sometimes do shows and bands and stuff. There wasn't anything going on the stage at this point, but I was sitting having dinner, and I was watching these kids that it hurt me to watch because they were doing these tricks trying to do these tricks off of the stage on a skateboard. So you had this kid who I think was shirtless and had holes in his jeans, and the kids around him. I would guess if you wanted to stereotype and characterize those kids, my guess is those kids probably were not terribly successful as students, right? And I could very well be wrong. They might be top of the class, I don't know. But just as a stereotype, but they were trying to do this trick, but not only do it, but catch it on video. And so this kid was doing it over and over and over again, and he's scraping his knees, and it just kept going and going and going to the point where, again, it was sort of painful. But I remember thinking, clearly they're not losing interest in this and are working so hard to get this. But would they do that? What would that look like for them in a classroom? And of course, teaching is not about skateboarding, but where are those intersection points, and how do we design learning that's authentic and meaningful and real, that is not only academically and intellectually engaging, but is worth working on? Because as a teacher, I taught middle school, then high school. I taught special ed, emotional and behavior disorder kids, on up to later in my career, AP psychology. So you see this big difference. But again, getting back to that tension issue, and as it relates to student engagement, students come in for the most part excited to come to school as elementary kids. And you see that there's a Gallup poll that has a graph that they lose interest as they go through their educational career, and middle school, which certainly has its own issues around adolescence and what have you. But as it goes from middle school to high school, it just continues to drop. And to the point where you get, I think you sort of mentioned it, like, not only do they not want to be at school and do the work, but sometimes they're angry that you're asking them to do this work. And I'm not sure that I would blame them in many cases. Like, certainly we want them to be engaged learners, and there's sort of like this duality, this sort of game that teachers engage in, which can feel very true, but it's like, so I'm giving these kids this work and this great educational opportunity, and they just turn it down. And so you can't help kids who don't want to be helped. But the reality is they do want to be helped. They just don't want to be engaged in that kind of learning because, well, it's for the education, it's for the institution, it's for a score, it's for the adults. It's not really for them. And so how do we shift that? I think that's the sort of the interests and the learning preferences, is how do we help them not only by engaging them in work that is rich and meaningful, which is difficult with rigid curriculum and accountability. There's no doubt about that. So those pieces of the ecosystem need to change. But also their learning preferences. How do they get into the work in ways that are entry points for them? And that when you start to shift that, when we will see our educational system doing things that the ecosystem is really geared towards student interest and work and those intersections with meaningful content, I think that's where we're going to stop seeing that disengagement. We're going to see more engagement. And then it is really rich, differentiated instruction, and all kids, or at least more kids, will be able to engage in it.
That is, yeah. I wonder, as you're saying that, my question then is, as one of the PBL experts, then how do you address what I would say the various interests when you're working in the classroom? And I'm now speaking to the choir. So these are folks who agree with you. And my question to you then, when you go in and you're talking about PBL, how then do you help educators address the differentiation? Because that's where sometimes as well the inequities can show up, even with progressive-minded educators implementing something like PBL instead of lecture, for 50 minutes. So
right.
How do you see that when you're helping folks address that?
You mean as far as designing
the different learning interests that they have?
Right. Yeah, well, I think it really can be helpful to start that conversation with the inquiry part, right? So what are the questions and what are the ways that we can engage them in inquiry around topics, if you will, and doing things like the question formulation technique. So if there's a piece of content or a set of sort of theme of content that you want to teach and need to teach because that's in your course content, what are some things that we can present to them that will give them opportunities to generate questions? And now we know if they're questions that they're asking, I don't think it's too unsafe to assume that they might be interested in that. And then can we align the work that they're doing with those questions that they have asked? And again, if they're pulling those questions and from the stem of a question focus that might be around your social studies content or even a math content, then it would be that's where teachers can make those connections back to content, if you will. Does that make sense?
Yes. So then it really forces, in a good way, an educator to really be open to whatever the student is interested in, to bring that into the classroom.
Right. It is a challenge, and so it doesn't mean, I'd like to say that we're not doing free range chicken where kids are just sort of going about and doing anything and everything. If you say passion projects or genius hour or 20% time, you have less constraints of content, if you will. But we know the reality is that there are science classes, there are social studies classes, there are math classes, and to the extent that we want to see that change and think about things differently, that's a side conversation, because the reality is today most schools have those silos, especially in high school and even on down into the elementary, middle school. So if we want to pull, like I'm fond of, I think about social studies, for example, as a history teacher. Every history teacher has heard a million times, why do we need to learn this, and when will we ever use it? And that's a very valid question. And so most history teachers will say, and actually most adults will say in response to that is, well, we need to learn history so we don't repeat it, which I think is absurd in some ways, because clearly we do repeat parts of history. We really struggle with, that as a dynamic. So history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it does, certain elements of it repeat itself. But why is it important to learn history? Well, history is there to instruct, and it's there to instruct us and help us make better decisions, become better citizens, and have better perspective. Well, if that's the case, then let's teach, instead of teaching history, let's teach and contextualize it in perspective and citizenship and how to be a better citizen. So if you break those pieces down, what does it take to be a better citizen? How can we help people become better citizens or more informed voters, or make better decisions, about our voting preferences or whatever? Now we have a reason to learn that history, and you can certainly connect that to student interest and in ways that might be, how do we help the disadvantaged have a stronger voice in our democracy? Now we're starting to get at pieces of empathy where it's like, okay, now that's worth working on. And to do that effectively, you need to know history, and you need to know how to speak and communicate, and you need to think about your audience, and so do deep critical thinking. So that to me is a way to get at it.
Well, and then what that, as you're saying that, what that sounds like to me is, again, realizing that then there are also students and teachers that are a lot the same, meaning that just as we have to do differentiated instruction for students, we need to realize that there are multiple ways we're going to reach teachers to be more effective educators.
Right.
And some sound like, as you're speaking, as educators who are talking about, I believe already in this, and I'm trying to learn how to. Whereas there may be other educators who are just in the system and are, quite frankly, overwhelmed, and so they may not. And I think, for educators, in hearing you speak, for the educators who are on board with PBL, or with at least rethinking how to move forward, they're doing this on their own, and how do we continue to support them? Which means, what are the tools that we can provide for them to keep that open mind?
Right.
And then for the educators who may not be on board just yet because they are so, what I would say, overwhelmed for whatever reasons, how do we support them with the tools? And this goes back to, again, the basic concept of, you get out what you put in. And if you have some great educators, you're going to come out with some pretty darn amazing students. And so how do we help our educators really, when we think about equity, I want to expand the notion that it's not just going off and reading, 10 books this year and going to a bunch of conferences so that your mind is more culturally competent, or your mind is more culturally right. That is important. But then how do we also just put on the ground these equity tools, just like as you've done with PBL, just some tools to get people started, or to help reinforce and get people started. I think that might be something that's missing in our field for ourselves.
Yeah, and to me, it's something to consider in there as well, is what are the questions that we can and should be asking of those educators who haven't really or aren't able right now to make that shift, that might help them think differently about that does sort of create that perceived need. Because once there's that perceived need, and once that motivation is there, I think that is a big piece in getting, because when it really becomes important to them, then they work on it themselves. It's not being pushed on them. It's sort of a pull. So, I don't know if it's worth, I think there are some really rich questions that would be worth considering in helping them shift their paradigm.
Absolutely. And Drew, what I'd want to share is on our website, e3educate.org. We have a free download of our YouTube video, and then literally a facilitative guide to go through the video that helps get to some of these equity questions around how brilliant are our students coming into the classroom. Because one of the concepts that we always talk about is this concept of cultural resilience. Not just resilient, but cultural resilience, meaning I'm resilient within my cultural context, whether that's an urban environment, suburban environment, rural environment, or whatever environment, low socioeconomic environment to high socioeconomic environment. I am resilient in my cultural context. Therefore, I build these skills, these 5 skills that we measure. But we like to say is that in sharing the video and helping students and teachers go through that video, they start to translate their life experiences into one of these 5 skills. And that, I think, as you said, is asking the right question. We would want to just share to folks, hey, that's just one tool. There are others, but if people were to check that out, they could see like, wow, this is something that's helping me as a teacher. get to the brilliance of what you said earlier, how you are smart, not just, that you're smart or not. And so
Right.
I think for us, that's one of the things that we would encourage educators to do, is to ask the right questions. And if they don't have their own questions to ask, we suggest, our facilitation video guide of that.
Yeah, and we will link to that on the show notes page on Teach Thought and We Grow Teachers. Before we wrap up here, there's a couple other pieces that you and I had discussed prior to going live here that I think are important pieces are the ideas of data analysis and lesson planning. So in terms of data analysis and equity, what does that how does that play out for you?
Yeah, what we like to say about those in short is the space of, oftentimes as educators, we have so much data coming to us, much like how students at 10 years old are having so much data coming to them. How do we make sense of it all? And so what we have focused on is, from an equity lens, when we look at data, how do we look at data so that it helps inform us about how to engage with students? And what we found in the educational research, and again, it was so much that we had to create a lit review, so there's not one source that we could share this to, is that basically students engage in three ways, meaning they engage in all three ways, but specifically they may engage in a starting point of one of the three. And that's through relationships, rigor, and relevance. So students need all three. But again, what students will do is they'll engage in one of the three ways. So to help do differentiated instruction as an educator, who do I start with on a rigorous level? Who do I start with on a relationship level? Who do I start with on a relevance level? And all of this data that comes to me, like data of student demographic information, behavior information, academic information. How can we have, as you said, the right questions to ask of all this data so that we can engage with students in these three ways? Because if compliance is an issue, which it is an issue for every educator, then we need to think about not the first, what's my discipline policy? What we need to think as educators is, well, does this student best engage through rigor, through relationship, or relevance? And once you know one of those three starting points for the students, then how do I become better at those three engagement strategies? So that's what we mean by data analysis, how to take in all of the data to do that. And if we get on another time, I'd love to dig in deep, and go down that rabbit hole of taking specific data points and how to go through that questionnaire.
And quickly, or if it's not possible to do this quickly, then just say so. But sort of quick takes before we wrap up on lesson planning.
Yeah. So for lesson planning, what we always want people to consider is again, to be more equitable. We want to help educators think about their audience, not just from the content perspective and age perspective. If I'm teaching, I always like to say, if I'm teaching sex education, I need to be teaching that all throughout, meaning it's such a hot topic, but how you teach it in elementary school is you're just teaching students to make sure that they understand private parts. That's all you're teaching elementary school children. In high school, you're teaching something else. You're teaching, hey, here's some consequences of any kind of sexual activity. Be aware of this. And so that's understanding that. When we talk about how do you teach to a diverse student body, which is a hot topic, what we like to say is in your lesson planning, we want you to, again, do the same thing in terms of understanding how your audience is going to react to the content that you're saying. So that may not be as explored, as detailed as I would like, but it's really understanding how do I intend to share this lesson plan that's going to impact how the audience reads my speaking of this. And the quick example of this is I'm going to use Louisville because I'm coming to love Louisville as I learn to work there more. But Drew, you and I know that I am not from Louisville, Kentucky at all. If I come in there and try to talk about, as a teacher, the content, and all I do is talk about the Kentucky Derby because I saw it one time on television, and that's what I'm going to teach that's my reference every year because I think I'm, being relevant to the community, then people are going to start looking at me really funny, at the end of the day. And it's August and it's September that I'm talking about this. So understanding the lesson planning that we offer is really understanding the lenses of how I'm coming to teach these topics. So I'd love to dig into that as well with you.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to differentiation pieces of interests and readiness and learner preferences and that kind of thing for sure. So, well, I think we're probably at the end of our time here, and as always, it's fun to talk with you about these pieces, and as we kind of dive into it more and explore our potential intersects, I'm excited for those possibilities.
Great. Likewise as well. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to the continued conversation of this dialogue.
That'll do it for today's podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and if you didn't hate it, please leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening, and share it on social media wherever you feel comfortable. Speaking of social media, you can find us in all the normal places like Facebook, Twitter, Google+, LinkedIn, Pinterest, and please share us on those places as well. And don't forget about TeachThought Professional Development. You can find us there at teachthought.com/PD.